Thank you, Dr. Tumlin, and it's really a delight for me to be here this evening and have this opportunity to present these thoughts to you. I'm honored that Dr. Bernard Lycan, Dr. Jitendra Mohanty, and Dr. William Lane Craig will be participants even as we interact on these very, very rigorous issues, an issue that each one of them has given serious thought to. And when Jim Tumlin invited me to come and address this, I knew one thing would be established beyond a reasonable doubt after the evening is over. When you consider the scholarship of these gentlemen who we'll be interacting with, my willingness to come here and address the subject will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that some suffering is voluntary. And I have no doubt about that. The closer the deadline came, the more I began to ask myself, why on earth did you get into this? It's a little bit reminiscent of C.S. Lewis, who wrote one of the most powerful books on the subject, The Problem of Pain, in which at one point he says, if only this toothache would go away, I could write another chapter on the problem of pain. But here we are dealing with this, and I believe it is reflective of your interest and the interests of people in many parts of the globe who are tuning in and listening in at the same time. Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century's Scottish political activist, made this comment. When you think of the remarkable foresight he had in saying this, you'll see how appropriate it is for our time. Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws. What Andrew Fletcher was really envisioning or reflecting is that the artists, the musicians in particular, reflect the ethos and the pathos of a culture. They do not have to worry about being academically precise. They express the existential struggle that they go through in many areas of living. And this indeed is one of them. In our time, the songwriters address the issue just as cogently. Some years ago, the Moody Blues put it in these words: why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? One can sympathize with that, and the cry resonates within each one of us. But you know, the one thing I noticed with every author or artist who addressed this issue, the treatment generally began with a long litany or a list of all the atrocities and tragedies that we have witnessed either in that week or in our generation or in the previous century. It seems, although they feel compelled to establish the point in its direst reality. And the more you begin to read authors on this, that is where almost everyone begins. But there was another very subtle fact I noticed, that many of them, while they knew where to begin in raising the question, struggled in where to begin while giving the answer. That, I believe, is an immense and a real challenge. Some years ago, the Far Side comic strip was picturing a massive butlers' convention going on. Thousands of butlers in their tuxedos had gathered. But ironically, the focus of attention was in the center of the ballroom, where one butler was lying stabbed to death. And an investigator with his assistant was standing looking at this butler stabbed to death, looking at a room full of butlers and looking at his colleague and saying, I hate to begin a week this way. Who done it in a butler's convention presents a very, very difficult challenge for an investigator. And when you're dealing with the problem of evil, you very quickly begin to recognize that it is not merely a problem. Even the problem itself is multifaceted. But what's real, I believe, is the entanglements soon make it look more like a mystery. Now, let me say this very clearly right from the beginning. When I use the word mystery, I am not at all suggesting that, therefore, it does not need any explanatory power. I'm only suggesting to you that there are many converging lines of evidence, both from logic and from experience, that one will need to bring. But I like what Gabriel Marcel said in distinguishing a mystery from a problem. Here's what he said. He said, a mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. A mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. Getting to Mars, said Marcel, is a problem. Falling in love is a mystery. You get involved in some way. You are very much part of the very question you are raising. But let me begin. I would like to lay out some initial thoughts for you and then begin the challenge to the views that will question the Christian worldview. First, the reality of evil and suffering. David Hume said it this way: were a stranger to drop suddenly into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills, a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field strewn with carcasses, a fleet floundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, and pestilence. Honestly, I don't see how you can possibly square with an ultimate purpose of love. Another existentialist put it in these words: it is not science that has led me to doubt the purpose of God. It is the state of this world. It is this pitiless, unending struggle for existence among the nations. It is the collapse of our idealisms before the brute facts of force and chaos, that there is a radical twist in the very constitution of the universe which will always defeat man's hopes, make havoc of his dreams, and bring his pathetic optimism crashing in disaster. Purpose, look at the world, that settles it for me. Clearly, there is a reality of evil and suffering. But secondly is the universality of it. Gautama, the Buddha, who is the progenitor basically of what we call Buddhistic thought, used the word dukkha. Now, dukkha is a word which carries an awful lot with it. It is not fair to merely represent it with the concept of suffering. It brings a weightier matter, the concept of impermanence. But what prompted the Buddha to deal with the issue was as he saw the reality of suffering, whether it was old age or sickness or death, he began to recognize that life was embattled by this reality. And as he began to find an answer, what prompted him was the reality of this, the impermanence that he saw, the transitoriness, and certainly the angst, the anguish of existence. So there is the reality of it, the universality of it, and then there is the complexity of it. When you deal with this problem, you may deal with it metaphysically, the very source of evil and suffering. The physical aspect, dealing with natural disasters. The moral aspect, how can an all-powerful or an all-loving God actually allow this? But as wide-ranging as these possibilities are, when you funnel them down, ladies and gentlemen, there are two distinct tracks on which you can step onto the problem. One is clearly the intellectual aspect of it. Truly, for the Christian theist, if God indeed, as the Bible reveals him to be, is in his sovereignty and power and loving nature, running the affairs of this world and superintending, then is there not the legitimate question behind it all, the question of how or why? So you can deal with this intellectually, or you can deal with it from the emotional or the practical aspect of it. You see, if I were to stand here, for example, and try to explain Augustine's answer to this, or some contemporary philosopher's answer to this, and you have just lost a child in the last week, all of a sudden these theorizings will seem so far away from what it is you're really looking for. So both of these are real, and there is a place in which they have their legitimacy. I will try to draw some from the intellectual struggle and some from the existential or the emotional aspect. And obviously, we can't deal with it in any comprehensive sense. Hopefully, as the other gentlemen join me on the panel and in our interaction, some of the issues that have not been raised here might also surface. But as I begin, I want you to pause now and bear this in mind. Every worldview has to deal with the problem. Every worldview has to deal with the problem. Whether you come from a theistic viewpoint, an atheistic viewpoint, a pantheistic viewpoint, there is such a weightedness to this issue that in some way it has to be either explained or, as some might try, to even explain away. And when every worldview deals with it, you'll notice something very fascinating. Number one is this: subsumed in every answer you will find, or assumed in every answer, is the purpose of life that has been assigned by that worldview. Do you follow what I'm saying? When you're dealing with an explanation of evil or suffering, you have assumed within your answer what the purpose is for human existence. C.S. Lewis says when a ship goes into the high seas, it has to answer 3 questions. Number 1, how to keep from sinking. Number 2, how to keep from bumping into other ships. And number 3, why is it out there in the first place anyway? How to keep from sinking may be personal ethics. How to keep from bumping into other ships may be social ethics. Why is it out there in the first place is essential ethics. And most secular humanists I have read or interacted with have assigned no established purpose, and we will sustain this as we go. So my beginning point here is to present a challenge, first of all, to the naturalist, the one who denies the existence of God, or even to the religious atheist, as Dr. Mohanty will be representing today, that position. You may find that a strange term, but he's very comfortable with describing his position and representing it that way. So explicitly, I will be dealing with the naturalist, but implicitly, I believe we will be addressing even the issues that we'll be interacting on later on with the others. I borrow a metaphor from Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, to begin my challenge. Sartre wrote a book some years ago called No Exit. In that, he pictured the struggle of an individual or of humanity doomed to find meaning in a meaningless world and struggling to escape this thrustness, this nihilistic sense that just impedes your day-to-day existence. How an individual can try to break away from this, and he said there was really no exit from the reality of that kind of meaninglessness. And what I want to say to you is this, that the naturalist, in trying to escape or challenge the theistic framework, looks for doors through which to make the exit, and I'm suggesting those doors are marked no exit. Let me sustain those points for you. The first door is the evidential challenge that wants to take leave of God. If one grants the presence of evil, they say, then you cannot really talk about a viable entity, an all-powerful and an all-loving God. I remember being at the University of Nottingham where a student shot up from his chair and said to me, there's too much of evil in this world, there cannot be a God. And I said to him, but sir, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? Yes, he said. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled for a while and he said, yes, I will grant you that. I said, but when you say there's such a thing as a moral law, are you not in some way assuming a moral lawgiver? Because if there is no moral lawgiver, there is no moral law. If there is no moral law, there is no absolute good. If there is no good, there is no evil. What is your question? Because you're trying to disprove the moral lawgiver. You know, he stood there staring at me and he says to me, what then am I asking you? Now, maybe he was not as sophisticated in his ability to untangle this and felt somewhat trapped by it. But let me tell you this. People even more sophisticated than him have struggled with this issue. When Bertrand Russell was debating the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, Copleston looked at him and said, Mr. Russell, do you believe in good and bad? Russell said, yes, I do. How do you differentiate between good and bad? Russell says, the same way I differentiate between yellow and blue. But how you differentiate between yellow and blue by seeing, don't you? Yes. How then do you differentiate between good and bad? Bertrand Russell said, on the basis of my feeling, what else? Now, you know, Copleston was a kind man, but somebody could have easily turned to Russell and said, in some cultures they love their neighbors, in other cultures they eat them, both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference in the matter? Now, just in case you think this is a straw man that is being set up, let me present it to you syllogistically here. Objective moral values exist only if God exists. objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. Now, in the first premise here, objective moral values exist only if God exists. This is challenged, of course, by the naturalist, challenged by the skeptic, and he or she says, I don't have to accept that. But I'll tell you what, the struggle that they find when they turn away from objective moral values is a monumental struggle, because the fact of the matter is, outside of God, they are not able to anchor objective moral values, and yet intuitively they know that some objective moral values can be so certain within your own mind. And yet unable to anchor it, they move away then from that to try and come out with some other explanation, maybe a very subjective notion of this. Now, I want you to follow the argument, because I want to trace for you how the questioner here gets encroached within the problem, and the mystery really draws the questioner in. Probably one of the strongest voices against the Christian worldview is J.L. Mackie, who brought the evidential argument from evil to light, saying that with the presence of evil, this is a strong argument against the existence of God. But even J.L. Mackie said this: we might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Did you hear that? We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. And so the skeptic is ending up with a serious problem to try and explain how an impersonal, amoral first cause through a non-moral process produces a moral basis for life. Mackie says, when you start talking about objective ethics, it presents such an awkward problem for us that you almost have to invoke the reality of a transcendent being. But since it is so awkward to do that, he moves towards a subjective notion of ethics. What then happens if you move away from the objectivity of good? What happens to the problem of evil? There's a short step. Listen to Richard Dawkins of Oxford University, the renowned anti-theistic thinker. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So from denying the moral lawgiver, as it were, and not finding a point of grounding for objective good, they move secondarily to the step that maybe even evil as we see it does not really have an objective reality to it. If that is the case, you move then to the third step, and you begin to see how the mystery now truly suctions in the individual who presents as the challenge to theism. Hobart Maurer, one-time professor at Harvard and Yale, an American president of the American Psychological Association, who committed suicide several years ago, made this comment in an article. He was not a Christian by any stretch of the definition of the terms here. But listen to what he says. For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and we've acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to be sick rather than being sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deeper sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean? This is a secular thinker saying this, in removing objective good and moving away from the objective notion of evil and taking away this vertical dimension that psychologists were so want to resist in the notion of sin. He said, all of a sudden we've lost the very roots of our being, and we now wander around like neurotics asking ourselves, who am I? This internal inconsistency from the questioner who raises the problem of evil has therefore become the object of satire by some very good thinkers. G.K. Chesterton is a case in point. Listen to how he says it. All denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, and then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is forever engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt becomes practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. Door number 1, nothing normative. It's marked no exit. Door number 2, but we can be good without God, someone might say. Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson published a massive piece of work in which he says this: scientists and humanists should consider together the possibility that the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of philosophers and biologicized. Even the computer questioned my use of the word. Biologicized there, taken away to biology to somehow explain it biologically. There are so many questions that come when you do this and move towards evolutionary ethics. Unfortunately, time flees so quickly in this. So let me raise just one question. How do they explain what is known in the world of ethics as supererogatory acts, acts of great nobility? Some years ago, an Amtrak train plunged into some swirling, deadly waters because a bridge collapsed underneath them. Tremendous stories came out of that of human heroism. Probably the best was Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey's story. Struggling to stay alive, their primary concern was to thrust their 11-year-old daughter, Andrea, who was stricken with cerebral palsy and bound to a wheelchair. How they thrust her into the arms of rescuers, paying in the process with their own lives. But their goal was to get her to safety. How does evolutionary ethics explain this? For evolutionary ethics' entire schema says that first comes self-preservation, then progeny preservation, then lateral relative preservation, and then social altruism. You scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. But the bottom of it all is the protection of the strength that you can give, the strongest that you are. And here are parents protecting one so dependent, so fragile, so needy, so weak. Daniel Goldman, in his book Emotional Intelligence, begins his book with this to tell us it's about time we began to evaluate more how our ethics are tied into our very emotional makeup. Door number 2, we can't be good without God. Numerous unanswered questions, that's just one of them. But here the divide widens. Not only is there no explanation for such noble deeds, but the converse is even more scary. If man is done nothing but, where will that lead us? Viktor Frankl said this: if we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we will then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely sincerely convinced, says Franco, that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some Ministry of Defense or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Strong words as the gap widens if we are nothing but. Door number 2 presents a challenge to be used as an exit. Door number 3, if God is all-powerful, why could he not have always made us to choose good, is what the challenge comes. Here, I think it is important, we may get more time to discuss this, but very simply a statement can be made that will lead me into my Christian response. Somewhere, somehow, fallaciously, the skeptic has assumed that omnipotence means God can do anything. No, if God can do anything, the question would dissolve, wouldn't it? If God could make something mutually exclusive, then he can be loving and evil at the same time. You cannot put that which is mutually exclusive and say, why can't God do that? When you talk about intrinsic freedom, can you really talk about a freedom that is so engineered and reined in? I find this rather ironic coming from the skeptics, because the same skeptic arguing for the age of the universe and rightly arguing for it in its billions of years and all of that, they make this comment, how can it be much younger than that? Why would God deceive us by giving us units of measurement that are not really representing what actually is? That would be a deceptive way, wouldn't it? But when they put their ethical hats on, they then want a freedom that is not actual. That there can be a deception to that freedom, that we can be free but always choose good at the same time. Alvin Plantinga has responded to this very convincingly in his response to J.L. Mackie and Anthony Flew. But what then of the Christian worldview? How does this really play out as God reveals himself here? Very quickly. First, God is the author of life. And in that authorship, God reveals himself not only as good, but as holy. It is important to bear this in mind. Not only good, but God is holy, meaning separate. Life is then intrinsically sacred, not a conferred sanctity by society, not a pragmatic sanctity that allows us to keep from eating each other up. This is an intrinsic sanctity, which means my race, my humanity, my sexuality are sacred gifts given by God to me as I have been fashioned in his image. Modern day artists reverse those very things, and that's why violence and sensuality become the occupation of so many in their entertainment. God made life sacred, sexuality sacred. Life is intrinsically sacred. Secondly, and quickly, if God is the author, then there is a script. There is a storyline. The storyline tells us what life is all about and meant to be. If you remember, any one of you have seen Phantom of the Opera, there used to be times I'll be driving in my car listening to some of its music. Some of it was jarring. Some of it was sort of almost discordant until I saw the play. Once you saw the play and knew the story, you knew how the music fit in very well. If God is the author, there is a storyline. If there is no storyline, the logical consequences are horrendous impossibilities. Steve Turner, the English journalist, says, if chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. I remember going to hear Stephen Hawking at Cambridge University. And as you know, he speaks through his speech synthesizer. His question was, is man determined or free? A marvelous lecture at the end of which he says this, yes, man is determined, but since we do not know what is determined, he may as well not be. There was silence in the auditorium. There is a storyline, but we don't know it. There is a determinism here, the stranglehold of determinism, but since we don't know what it is, we may as well not be. Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard repeatedly says, there is no higher purpose, there is no higher meaning. For the Christian, number one, God is the author, life is sacred. Number two, there is a storyline. Number three, and quickly, if there is a story, what is the response? The response is that of worship. Worship is the first solitary response. That's why the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. Why is that? Because all that you see in diversity outside is only representing what is going on the inside. The life on the inside needs to be harnessed first. And worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. That was given by Archbishop William Temple years ago. You see, the goal and the process of life's script is not just to do good deeds. It is the sanctity of the inner life, the binding together of all of my propensities. And when that is bound together, worship can be expressed not only at a church altar. Worship can be expressed in the place of work where you are involved and employed. Wasn't it not Eric Liddell in the film Chariots of Fire who said, God has made me for a purpose for China, but He's also made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposite of sacred in that sense is not secular. The opposite of sacred is profane, and profanity is where evil finds its ultimate expression. So worship is the first response, and out of worship comes love. And if love is the legitimate response of a free heart, love can never be coerced. It is the supreme ethic, worship of God, and love of your fellow human beings. Even Jean-Paul Sartre granted this. The man who wants to be loved does not desire the enslavement of the beloved. He is not bent on becoming the object of passion which flows forth mechanically. He does not want to possess an automaton. And if we want to humiliate him, we need only try to persuade him that the beloved's passion is the result of a psychological determinism. The lover will then feel that both his love and his being are cheapened. If the beloved is transformed into an automaton, the lover finds himself alone. And by the way, even Bertrand Russell granted in his letters that love was the one thing he never fully experienced. So worship is the legitimate response out of which love flows. But then comes the heart of this issue. And I want you to give me your undivided attention here. Because as theologically rich as it sounds, some of the greatest thinkers in the world have said this to them has been the most meaningful aspect of the Christian faith. This brings us to the core of the matter. How is such love possible? Here, suffering enters center stage. The essence of the Christian message is found in the cross. It is not something Jesus wanted, but something for which, the very purpose for which He came. Let me read a paragraph I've penned on this. As the cross drew nearer and the shudder was felt, He struggled only to say, for this very cause did I come into this world. With double force He embodied the destructiveness of evil and its cost by showing what humanity can descend to when God is rejected. God allowed the one whose life was lived perfectly to suffer not by His own instigation, but by ours. Human will gone wrong academically raises the question of innocence and suffering. But in actuality, by exalting itself over God, it in fact instigates it and justifies it. In the greatest trial of all time in history, before a human jury, a crescendo of voices called for the release of a criminal and sending the innocent one to be crucified. Even Mahatma Gandhi, a devout Hindu, said that he found the cross of Christ to be the most overwhelming aspect of the Christian faith and singularly unique. Martin Luther King himself voiced the same. Here we get to the crux of suffering and the Christian answer. I believe the more we understand this, whatever else we may conclude, we will have to grant its uniqueness. Let me try and illustrate this for you. Elie Wiesel, when he was in Auschwitz, along with some of his other cellmates, was called out to witness the hanging of 3 Jewish men. 2 of them were older, 1 was a young man. And Elie Wiesel said it was a horrible, difficult thing to go through. The first 2 of them died rather instantly, no resistance. The young man struggled and kicked in the gallows, and as he was hovering in the throes of death, Wiesel says, I heard a man standing behind me muttering, God, where are you? Where is God in all of this? Where are you, God? And he says, seemingly out of nowhere, there welled up within me the same question, where is God? Where is He? He says, equally out of nowhere, the voice emerged saying this, right there, hanging on the gallows, where else? right there hanging on the gallows. Where else? Now, I want to ask you this question. Why did Wiesel even ask the question, where is God? Where are you? The three doors that the skeptic tries to escape through. The evidential problem ends up being swallowed up by the problem when no objective moral good is affirmed. Try to come out with an evolutionary ethical system. Numerous factors are unexplainable. And thirdly, the question, why did not God create us to make us choose good? When love and worship are the central features, choice is inherent. Let me summarize them. Number one, God is the author of life. Life is sacred. Number two, there is a script and a transcendent purpose to life. Number three, that purpose is in the response to the sacred. Worship, the outflow of which is love. Number four, but how does one do this when evil itself seems so intrusive? The cross redefines the reality of evil and shows God right in the middle of our need. Number five, the problem of evil and suffering is internal before it is external. Death to self sprouts life in uniqueness. Finally, it is not weariness of pain that brings meaninglessness, but weariness with pleasure, and worship alone is the perpetual novelty. Yes, the songwriter raises the question, why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door? Thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, even the artist knew how to go beyond just the question, and this is the way the song ends. I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. I believe they would have found that answer in Jesus Christ. So I present this paper to you. I want you to know it is not easy because there are challenges, immense challenges. And I want you to know that as tough as it is, I am utterly convinced that outside of the Christian answer and the cross of Christ, there is no answer. In fact, I'm not even sure how the question is ultimately going to be justified. But I think it's wonderful that in an occasion like this at the Faith and Science Lecture Forum, we can interact with those who will strongly disagree with us. And my hope is that somehow in this interaction, we'll be able to see the strength or the weakness of various arguments and various issues. It was on this issue one day, sitting high atop a huge building in Dallas, Texas, where a businessman kept raising the question of evil and evil and evil and evil, and he kept raising it repeatedly. And finally, the man sitting next to me, watching us interact on this for hour after hour after hour, he looked at this businessman and said to him, I appreciate the fact that you're very, very concerned about the evil that you have seen around you. Can you help me to know you a little better so that I can hear you say what you have done about the evil that you have seen inside you? And there was pin drop silence. The answer is both external and internal. I've gone at high speed because I want to get a lot of this out here. We look forward to the discussion. Thank you for listening. I hope it's not been a drink from a fire hydrant. Take care.